So whenever I come to a conference, I'm really intrigued about the process that a security researcher goes through to get to the point of presenting their findings. I think that a lot of the time in this industry, we spend time talking about the outcome of our work and not sharing with each other how we go about our work. So before I ever presented at a conference, I was really enthralled by the mystique that we grant researchers. There's something about the process of being accepted into a conference that makes them feel like, almost like they've got this rock star status. And I think there's a few industries outside of security where we have a similar thing going on. So if you look at musicians or artists, we also grant them this sort of special status. And we somehow see that they're different from us. But as it turns out, it's not really the case. So as a debt to myself, and I think as a way to be more transparent to everyone in the industry, I want to tell you a bit about my process for security research, and I think it's quite unique. It's one process, so certainly other researchers will have a different process. And I think for me, this started before I entered the security industry. So my secret is that I don't have a conventional education in computer science. My entry into this industry was a little bit strange, which I'll tell you about. So when I was growing up, I had a dream that I think a lot of people have when they're a kid. I dreamt about changing the world. And I thought the best way to do that is to actually see myself in roles. So I thought about the jobs that I could take when I was older. So the first job I considered was to be a ballet dancer. It doesn't necessarily sound like a job that you can make a lot of change in, but I actually believe that dance is a place that you can make a lot of change, that's for sure. But the problem with this is I was quite a tall child, so this wasn't a profession that I could continue. And I also had a strong affinity with animals when I was growing up, and I loved my pets. And I thought maybe I can be a vet because I could save animal lives. But the thing about being a vet is you're also responsible for the death of animals. I also thought about joining the Royal Air Force because they have this program which sponsors you to also carry out your education. So in return for meeting some sort of academic merits, they will pay for your education so you can do your undergraduates, and then you'd need to work with them for about 5 years afterwards. But the problem with this idea is I figured I might end up dead pretty quickly. So eventually I settled on being an artist. You see, the thing about art is historically it's brought visibility to all sorts of injustices. There's some really incredibly powerful work, and it has a way of disseminating into popular culture. So it affects the clothes that we wear. It really affects everything that we do. So art is something that I consider to be my disease, and it's helped me to foster all sorts of qualities that I think are really important to security. And I'd like to share with you a quote by an artist called Tim Rowlands, and he says, "What sort of person wants to make art in the first place? Artists are literally diseased people. We live with a condition, a disorder that questions the existing order of things, a disease with the world that cannot be cured, but can only be managed as best as possible." And I think there's a few people sat in this room that can probably relate to that idea. So researchers have this incessant need to question the order of things. And the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought that art and security are actually related in some ways. You see, when you think about art is actually thought manifested. So if you go into a gallery and you look at artwork, that is actually not too dissimilar from seeing a presentation where I talk about my ideas or seeing some of the talks you're going to see later. They're just a product of a different process. So as you can see, artists and security researchers have quite a lot in common. I think if you're a security researcher, if that's your full-time job or if that's something that you do independently outside of the work that you do on a day-to-day, you have to spend a huge amount of time coming up with creative ideas. You have to question a lot of things, which is the nature of being an artist. You also tend to spend a lot of your time alone, and it can be quite a thankless job. And interestingly enough, a lot of the time when you work as a researcher or an artist, you can spend time exploring an idea, and at the end of it, you might have nothing to show. But both of these jobs share in common that at some point you need to show to the world what you've come up with. So as a researcher, that may be that you talk about your ideas internally to provide value to the company, or that you go externally and you talk about your ideas at a conference. So you might submit to a CFP. So this is my methodology, my toolkit, and the things that I use as a way to live a very creative life. It helps me to be a better researcher. And it's a process I've learned from art. So I'm calling it art as a methodology for research. So the first thing is that creativity is obviously a big part of being an artist or researcher. And creativity I like to think about like a muscle. It's something that you have to use all the time, because you never know when inspiration might strike. Do you know what's really fascinating about creativity? Is that it's something that's innately human. So when our brains developed, when our frontal lobe developed, that's the thing that allows us to be creative. So that allows us to think ahead and to imagine different possibilities. So the actual act of being creative is taking all the input we experience on a day-to-day and combining that into different options. It's not so much about coming up with an idea that doesn't exist, but it's about finding different inputs in your life and you coming up with a third option. So the first tool that I use, that artists use a lot, is something called an artist sketchbook. And this is a place where I think you can record your thoughts and have a dialogue with yourself before you invest additional time into making something. So it can be a place where you record visual ideas, it can be a place where you record written ideas as well. And it can take many forms. So here's an example by an artist called Olafur Ellison, and you may have heard of him or you may not, but he's quite a famous artist, and in his work he asks us to reconsider our relationship to the environment. And he's had an exhibition on at the Tate Modern in London recently, and you can see the way in which he uses a sketchbook. So instead of using a physical book, on the left-hand side, we can see that the way in which he explores his ideas is he tapes things on the walls. And then on the right-hand side, you can see his thoughts about materials and prototypes when he was developing a specific product. So he made a solar-powered light, and here we can see the things that he's considered. And here's an example of my own sketchbooks. This is the first time I've showed anyone. So I work on a wall quite a lot, and I was thinking about how is it possible for us to introduce greater privacy into the clothes that we wear. So that's a consideration for this. But of course, it doesn't have to just be sketchbooks. I also work a lot with notebooks, and I think that they can be easier to work with. I know a lot of people keep electronic notes, but there's something nice about having tangible books that you can carry with you. And if that doesn't work, I also often tape things to the wall. So here you can see my thinking about the magnetic stripe. So I'm really fascinated by payments. And so one of the things I've been thinking about recently is reconsidering our relationship to things that we think we know, that we might take for granted. So I've been thinking about the magnetic stripe on the back of a card. So next, this is a really important thing, and it's something I would encourage everyone to do. So I suggest that you get a hobby or multiple hobbies outside of information security. And this is really important because what it does is it increases the scope of your inspiration. So this year I took a life drawing class. I taught myself to sew, which you can see the product of here. We'll get into that later. I tiled the kitchen and I built an ottoman. I did many other things as well. And all of these things might seem unrelated to each other, and they might seem unrelated to security research. But the important thing about hobbies is that it teaches you how to manifest your ideas in the real world. And the thing is, even if you're a security researcher, the best way to explain your idea to the world may not be in the form of a PowerPoint, and it may not be electronically. So the more options you have for materializing your ideas, the better, ultimately. Okay, this is what I would call a lifestyle approach. So question everything, and this is really about being curious to the world. It sounds like a very obvious statement, and it's something that I think we all have as children that we grow out of as adults. But this is really important. So it's really important to be curious about everything around you, even if you're making IKEA furniture and the question is, can I put wheels on that? What does it look like if I lie on the floor and look at the ceiling instead? How does that change my perspective on the world? And I'll show you how important this is even to my work. All right, so at the end of university, I had made a lot of creative work. So my degree is in a creative subject. And I didn't really know what to do with this physical work. I didn't have the space. I was moving out of student dorms, and I thought I would probably just have to give away my work or throw it away. And then I had a passing conversation with someone in my full-time job, and they mentioned to me that they had a relative who worked in a building very close to a very famous art dealer called Charles Saatchi, who at the time was collecting the works of very provocative artists such as Damien Hirst, and he was cutting cows in half. And I thought, what if I could come up with a plan to send my art to this art dealer? And I had one piece of art in particular. So I had a sort of 3D photo sculpture of myself. And I thought, maybe there's a possibility for me to send this in the post, yes, unbelievably, to this art dealer. And the thing about art dealers, especially people of this caliber, they don't accept unsolicited works, so you can't just send a package to them even if you know the address, because they won't sign for it, they won't accept it into the building. So I worked out a plan to get the security guard of another building to sort of forewarn the people in this other building where the art dealer was. So I took my photo sculpture, so we say, wrapped it up in brown paper. It looked pretty much like this. It looked pretty strange. And then I walked it from my flat to the post office, took it to the clerk and asked to send it. And they looked at me pretty strangely, I have to say. But they did accept it. And then a few days later, I got an email. We'll put that over there for now. I got an email from the staff at Charles Saatchi saying that they have received my artwork. So the point of this story is that this isn't about security, but it's about having a mindset. A lot of people would look at this story and say this is social engineering, but it's about being curious. A couple of years ago, I managed to buy an ATM, and you can see my two cats there, playing with the ATM, which was a lot of fun. And it sounds like a very hard thing to do, which it is. If you're an individual, it's quite hard to buy an ATM if you're not a bank. But the hardest part of owning an ATM is moving the ATM. So ATMs weigh quite a lot, and this ATM weighed 850 kilos, so close to a ton. And as it turns out, most of the couriers in London and the southeast of England have a tail lift, so that's the bit on the back of the lorry that goes up. That's rated for a maximum of half a ton or 650 kilos. That was the highest I could find. Yeah, so that's a big problem. Otherwise, you need a crane. And ATMs, part of the security is about not moving the ATM. So how did I figure out how to move the ATM? Well, I thought that there's probably a bit of room for error in the engineering process. And that's how I figured out how to move an ATM, is I found someone who could lift 650 kilos and got them to lift 850, and it worked. So the next approach that I would like you to embrace is to move your body. I think in security and in tech, we have this approach, or we quite often think of ourselves as a head, staring at a computer, and that's how we live our lives. But the thing is, everything that you do in your life is an embodied experience, so you're not a head and a body, you're actually a body. And this is really important, so I would encourage everybody, whatever you're interested in, to use your hands to make things, to do things, it changes your relationship to your work. So, as example, as I mentioned, I'm interested in cards. So today, I turned up as an electromagnet. Now that might look very funny, but you see, dressing as an electromagnet changes my relationship to my own work, and maybe it changes your relationship to the ideas that I want to share. So maybe it's not such a crazy idea to embody the things that you do. So I am really an electromagnet. And yeah, I did say that I taught myself to sew, and this is one of the outcomes of that. So I don't know if you can remember that bar magnets, they normally have a north and a south pole, and those poles are indicated by colours, normally just to help it become a bit clearer for us. So with an electromagnet, the only difference is that you're passing a current through the magnet, and if you change the direction of the current, you can change the polarization of the magnet from north to south, depending on the direction of the current. All right, so find the context for your work. The context for your work as a security researcher gives you meaning for doing your work. It shows you other possibilities, how you can manifest your work. So this is really important. And how you find the context for your work is you ask yourself, who are my peers? So who's operating this space? You ask yourself, what is the reason for making my work? And where is my work situated? And what I mean by that is it important that your work is situated in 2019, or does it have some relevance to other time periods? So, for example, for my own work, what I do is I look at security research and I ask myself, who's making work that might be relevant to mine? So it might be someone like Adam Laurie, who's been around for quite a long time in the security industry. But it's also artists. So this is a Greek artist called Takis, who has been making a lot of work about manifesting energy. So for me, my peer group is also artists. It's also people who are working outside of art and research, so they might be working in science. So when you find the context for your work, it's really important not to limit yourself to a single discipline. I also find that children's books are really informative because they have an excellent way of explaining ideas, so I refer to those a lot. So who is my peer group? My peer group for my own work are people like Sami Kamkar, Adam Laurie, but also artists. So I've got this artist here, Takis, and a sound artist called Adam Blamey. So even if you're a security researcher, you should look outside of your discipline. There's a lot going on that could influence your work. And why do I make my work? Well, I feel that payments aren't particularly well understood. But also, importantly, I think education, and this is one of the reasons why we're all here today, is really important. And if you have the ability to share knowledge with other people, then you should do so. So next we enter the nothing is precious phase, or this is where you start prototyping if you're a researcher or an artist. And nothing is precious because at this point you don't want to invest too much in materializing your ideas, you just want to work quickly and come up with different ideas. So when I think about a magnetic stripe, see if I can get that to play. So I've been thinking about magnetic stripe recently. And a way of visualizing that. So you can visualize that by showing the magnets on the back of the card. So this is fluoro fluid. And what I did is I just added a bit of water to it, because fluoro fluid has magnetic particles in it, and it has a surfactant which allows it to bind to water. So if you add a bit of water, you can make it viscous enough to work to show up the magnets on the back of a cup, which is pretty handy. Or you can visualize it like this. You can actually use iron filings, which will show you up the permanently magnetized parts of a card. But there's another way of thinking about this as well. So here I have some magnets which are polarized in different directions, and another magnet. So you can see as it moves, it's either attracted or repelled from the magnets. So now we come on to the phase of manifesting your ideas. So this is an illustration I've made of a work by an artist called Joseph Kuseth, and the work is called 1 and 3 Chairs. And in the work, there's a chair that you can physically sit on and you can touch. It's just a normal chair. And the artist hasn't made the chair, so he's bought the chair. And next to the chair is a photograph of the same chair. And next to that is the dictionary definition of a chair. So what's happening in this piece of work? Well, I think what it does is it shows us that there's many different ways of manifesting an idea. So the first way in which we think we can show our idea may not be the best way. There's at least 3 others. And I think in security, for the longest time, people like me have been standing on a stage talking to people like you about our ideas. So DEF CON's been running for, I think, 27 years, and CCC has been running for about 36 years. And in most of the modern history of conferences, people like me have been talking to people like you using a PowerPoint. But why is that? Is that because PowerPoints are the most effective way to show our ideas? I don't actually think so. So my thought is that in security, we need to spend more time showing our ideas in a creative fashion rather than talking about our ideas. In art, we use something called the studio critique to receive feedback. Now, this is something that I think in the InfoSec industry we could definitely adopt. So this is a way of receiving feedback on your thoughts and ideas, your work in progress, and also final ideas that you have to show. And what you do is you construct a peer group of people you know, and you go around your work and you talk about your work, and you can get friendly feedback before you present, say, at a conference or progress. And the benefit of this is someone else might have a better idea, or they might point something out in your work that you hadn't even noticed. Now, finally, we're able to prepare to show our work to an audience. So I'm going to show you an idea of mine in a slightly different way. You've probably been wondering what on earth this is. I don't know. So as I mentioned, I'm dressed as an electromagnet today. So if you can imagine that every time the invisible electricity changes direction, the magnet also changes polarization. So if we take a look at the back of a card, it has a magnetic stripe, which is made up of magnetic material, and then there's a layer of plastic over the top. So what happens when we write information on a card? So what happens is an electromagnet passes over the back of the mag stripe, and it permanently magnetizes particles on them. And it does that by changing direction from north-facing to south-facing. So we end up with zeros and ones. So when you pass the card back through a reader, those different polarizations influence the signal. So let me give you a demonstration. I do have magnets in my arms. All right, so hang on a second, I actually need to get a camera because this is such a big auditorium. I think you're probably not going to be able to see very well. So let me see. All right, hopefully this will make it a bit easier for you to see. Okay. I've still got audio, right. I'm going to walk slowly. Right. All right, so I'm going to walk slowly because there's a little bit of a delay. Can we drop the lights a bit? Is that possible? Oh, it's magic, isn't it? Okay. All right, so there is a bit of a delay, isn't there? Can we see that? So what happens as an electromagnet passes over the back of the card is we can permanently magnetize the different sections of the magnet. So let's have a look. Can we see that? Hello? No, that's very slow, isn't it? Never do a demo live, right? All right, we're going to have to just keep the lights down low, and hopefully you'll be able to see the lights, and I'm going to go over it. All right, so imagine we're getting back into the mode. I'm an electromagnet. I'm now facing the mag stripe. Now I can permanently magnetize this part of the mag stripe so that it's north facing up. I can then turn, hopefully you can see this, and permanently magnetize this part of the mag stripe. Can you see that at the back? Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. So I can go along the whole card. This is basically what's happening, but on a much smaller scale. And I can write to the card. Isn't that magic? No. But there's one more thing, all right? We're nearly there. If you've got this far, if you're a security researcher or interested in being a security researcher, now's the point where you need to iterate on your work and develop a body of work. And that's really important because what it means is if you iterate on your work, you can find subtle variations and you can build depth. Let me just turn this off. It's beeping at us. So building a body of work allows you to fully investigate an idea, and I really think that's important. So it's something that we do in art quite a lot, is an artist becomes known for a single sort of pursuit of an idea, and it's really important in research as well, because you gain a lot of depth. And finally, at this point, if you've been following my methodology, you've become a researcher or an artist. But guess what? You don't have to define yourself as either. You see, the beauty of information security is that we welcome everybody. And if you have interests outside of security, you can integrate them into your work. There's no reason why you can't. Thank you for having me. Any questions? No questions. All right. Enjoy the conference. Thank you so much.